Namo Guru Haspajaye.
You see that everything in samsara and nirvana is merely dependently arisen. You see the Dharmata of true being, that is the essence of all dependent arising. The power of your great insight fills the universe with auspicious light. O mighty Shepherd Dorje, please rise up now from within my heart. You see that everything in samsara and nirvana is merely dependently arisen. You see the Dharmata of true being, that is the essence of all dependent arising. The power of your great insight fills the universe with auspicious light. O mighty Shepherd Dorje, please rise up now from within my heart. You see that everything in samsara and nirvana is merely dependently arisen. You see the Dharmata of true being, that is the essence of all dependent arising. The power of your great insight fills the universe with auspicious light. O mighty Shepherd Dorje, please rise up now from within my heart. Jemila Shepherd Dorje la soadeso. 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 Lord Mila laughing Vajra, I call to you. 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 Lord Mila laughing Vajra, I call to you.
Wonderful name, isn't it? Laughing Vajra. Vajra is the indestructible true nature of reality. It ultimately then realises its own nature and all suffering ceases. So it's the laughing Vajra. Like laughing because it sees that all our suffering is actually not really happening in a funny way. It's like when you're tricked by it, you think it's all real and you suffer. And then when you realise the true nature of reality, you realise it's just an illusion. So it's funny. Laughing Vajra. But then out of compassion, when you realise that others don't realise that it's just a mistake and that they don't need to suffer, then there's this compassionate nature that just because it understands and knows what suffering is and that it's unnecessary, then there's this spontaneous energy just goes out to try to find ways to liberate others so that they can realise it too. So they can get the joke, as it were. But it's desperately sad while we don't get the joke, isn't it? So it makes it all the more tragic that actually we don't need to suffer at all, ever. But, it's all very well, but we're attaching to it all as real. You say, what does real mean? I don't think anyone knows. I think it's just that we're attached to something, and then we're attached to it because we're thinking it's something it isn't, and so we call that real. But it isn't what it seems to be, and so it's not real. And when we realise that, we realise, if you like, the real. So then it's a joke. And then we can join in helping all the other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to awaken others. Having awakening the unawakened. So it just struck me what a nice name that was, Laughing Vajra. It's a name that Milarepa was given when he was given initiation by Marpa, I think. First name he was given by Marpa. So, as those of you who've been before know, I'm working through this book called Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness, which is available in the hallway if you haven't already seen it. And it's an amazing book because it condenses down centuries of Buddhist polemics and maybe you call it philosophy and discussion about what emptiness means. And it condenses it all down into 5 main stages, which can be seen not as historical polemics between different schools, but as stages in a progressive understanding of what emptiness means in the Buddhist context. Since this was my doctoral thesis topic, I can easily get bogged down in it because, I can see problems at every turn. But at the end of each chapter, Rinpoche brings it all together and tells us how to meditate with this view. And that's the important thing, really. You don't really have to go through all the polemics of the philosophical schools in order to arrive at the right view when meditating. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that it's not philosophy, really. Like, philosophy is like, I suppose it depends what you mean by philosophy, but the idea that you can explain the nature of reality through ideas. Actually, this is anti-philosophy because it's trying to show that you can't explain anything with ideas. But ideas, talking about the ideas we already have is a way of noticing how we hold on to our ideas, and it's our attachment to our ideas that causes suffering. So that's why it's worth looking more and more in detail about what the Buddhists are talking about when they talk about emptiness. What are the ideas that we already have? And how are we clinging on to them? How are we attached to them? And how does that attachment lead to suffering? And the most subtle ones are the ones that we don't think of as ideas even. We don't think of time and space, for example, as ideas, do we? That's just necessary integral part of what reality is. It has to be in time and space, otherwise what is it? So we don't think of that as an idea until you actually start to look very closely in your experience to what exactly I mean by time in experiential terms. What do I mean by space in experiential terms? And it all falls apart. So the tendency then is to, again, philosophers, we're all philosophers in the sense we all try to explain our experience to ourselves. So based on assumptions that we've already come with, we try to make sense of it all as it falls apart. I get quite frustrated because you can't make sense of it all when you really look closely. And this is where meditation comes in, because it's not philosophy, it's pointing out something about the way we think. And the way we think, there's a problem with it because it leads to attachment. And the problem with attachment is it leads to suffering. So if we don't want to suffer, we've got to look at our attachment. And if we look at our attachment, we're going to see what the ideas are that we're clinging on to. And that goes back to the most basic assumptions that we're clinging on to. And to become liberated from those, well, first, you have to be in a state of mind where you're willing to let go of those attachments. So that requires a lot of preparatory work. And then even when you're willing to let go of those attachments, our habits of mind are so strong that it's very difficult to let go for more than just a fraction of a second. But even that's valuable. That is what we're going to have to go by for a long time. But the way we're going to become aware of this whole process is through meditation practice. And when I say meditation practice, I mean what the Tibetan word, what the Buddhist word for it is bhavana, which means we have to get used to it. And the way we get used to it is in sessions and breaks. So in the sessions we sit as still as we can without any distractions as far as we can, so that we can really focus on what is going on in our mind and experience, be much, much more clear about it. So first that needs a certain amount of discipline to be able to focus our mind enough to be able to see what's happening. And then when we come out of the meditation practice, hopefully we've had some insights, and then to carry those over into our life and to see their relevance in terms of how we live our lives. So that's what this book is about. It's progressive stages of meditation on emptiness, not just discussing it as a philosophical possibilities of different schools of Buddhist thinking. You think, well, why is it laid out then as if it is about these different schools of Buddhist thinking? I think it's historical, really, because there's hundreds of years of thought gone into how to practice and what the scriptures actually mean. And there's hundreds of years of layers of mistakes. Like, we all make all the mistakes, but we don't break it down into different kinds of mistakes. But over the centuries, people have thought, this is the way to explain it, and everybody will get it, and it'll be really right, and it'll make it easy from now on. And then the students, they pick it up and they think, oh, this is wonderful, they study it. And then, to the teacher's horror, they misunderstand it and they take it off in a direction that was never meant. So then another teacher comes along and says, oh, there's so much confusion, I can sort it out. If you think that this is the way he presents it, it's wonderful, everyone thinks it's wonderful, some people get enlightened and then people, yeah, I understand this. And they've introduced, again, a subtle mistake. So it's just been centuries of this kind of process. And that's what we've inherited, which in some ways is very rich, but in some ways could be just a heavy load, couldn't it? Yeah. At every stage, what you need is you need to put in the effort to try to understand it, and you need to look at your own experience. You need to meditate and reflect and try to find out what it is you're supposed to be, how it's supposed to work. And then you really have to ask. Each individual really has to ask to try and enter into that dialogue with somebody who understands better. Because, we all use words differently, we all have different ways of coming in on things, and I think if you don't have somebody there who you trust who's helping you through it, you could just have lots of different theories and ideas, which would be quite stimulating and maybe quite fun, but after some decades you might realise you've not moved on at all. So I think often that aspect of the teachings is not really highlighted in these texts. It's clearly needed. When I read them, I sort of feel, oh dear, anything I say could be misunderstood. Please come to me and tell me what you've understood so that I can go through it with you. But it goes out and, people read it and like it, and they tell me it's very clear and they've understood. And I notice every time I go through, there's more scribbles on mine about, what? Is that really right? What does that mean? Well, that could be understood in two ways, all the way through. So last time we were talking about the Citta Matra view, the mind-only school. So that the first stage was realising that the skandhas, that's our body and our mental processes, are impermanent and changing and are not self, because there's nothing there that isn't just changing all the time. So the next thing we looked at was the Citta Matra view, which was that it's kind of, actually the Citta Matra view is interesting. It really is, on the one side, really looking in more detail about what is mind anyway, what do we mean by consciousness, awareness, mind, and from quite an experiential point of view. And on the other side, like all Mahayana, it's a reaction to the Abhidharmist commentators. You won't know what Abhidharma is. Anyone know what Abhidharma is? Some people daring to admit they've heard of it. But basically, what happened when these Buddhist scholastics were trying to kind of firm up what they were defending as their doctrine against the other non-Buddhists who were around, they kind of had this idea that, well, we're looking at the not self of the skandhas, and we're looking at the true nature of reality. We're looking at all these dharmas, these sort of the Abhidharma. What are the actual, if you like, elements of our experience? If you're going to look at your experience, what are all the elements? What are all the objects of the senses? What are all the senses? What are all the different kinds of emotion? What are the kind of different elements in the world, like the earth, air, fire, water? What are they made of? What's all of this made of? Trying to list it all, define it all, and say, this is what we Buddhists are about. This is what we've studied, and this is what we know, and we know about how this is all not self, and not to be attached to any of this, and therefore, and through that path, through that becoming awakened. But I think it's somehow or other that enterprise separated itself off from the actual process of meditation, so it became much more of a kind of intellectual scholastic type exercise in many ways. Not entirely, I mean, these meditators were also interested. So that when the Mahayana came along, it was like almost as if the Abhidharmists were trying to define and say what truly existed and therefore should be, was worthy of examination. And the Mahayanists thought, well, hang on, that whole enterprise is wrong because you're trying to show what exists. When in fact, if you look carefully, you don't find anything exists. Well, not in the way we thought it did. And the Citta Matra were saying, for example, and very importantly, we assume that the outside world exists, separate from, even though we've said, the skandhas are not the self, nonetheless, the outside world is different from the mind that knows it. I think we'd all go along with that. We couldn't make sense of the world at all if we didn't make that distinction, could we? But when you look closely, you can't see or know anything outside of the mind. That's a really important pointing out instruction, in fact, because you might object when I say that and think, we'd have to have a long discussion about it, or a little bit of a discussion anyway. But maybe straight away, maybe you've already thought about this yourself. But then what? So what? Or maybe half of you are thinking, well, my mind's my brain. Sort of, I don't know who I'm talking to. But if you reflect for a bit about how would I know something that was outside of my mind? Well, mind knows things, doesn't it? So what do I mean? I'm receiving information, sensory input. But by the time I know it, by the time I'm aware of it, it's already a mental phenomena, isn't it? It's already mind. So I'm just maybe using reasoning or to work out, actually, but it's outside. Like babies throw their rattle out of the pram and they get this very interesting experience of it coming back. It's really exploring that edge, isn't it? Oh, here it comes. I wanted it to come and it came. Oh, so maybe if I want it, it makes it come. Now I want it and it doesn't come. It's very scientific, actually, isn't it? How do things come into my mind? They must come from outside, because otherwise everything would be inside, and then I wouldn't have any relationship with anything, would I? It'd be like it's all me, if you like. It's all inside me, and I'm determining everything, or not. Maybe I'm just not very good at making things appear like I want them to appear, but actually other things seem to be independently outside of me. That's how we become rational. That's how we become rational beings, isn't it? I mean, if we couldn't grasp that, we would really be in trouble, wouldn't we? So there's this kind of strangeness about that, though. This is where it's not really philosophy, it's more just look at your experience and recognising there's something going on. if I think that there's a knowing on the inside and the object on the outside, I'm using a certain way of thinking, aren't I? I'm kind of conceptualizing something and making it real or something and separate. And then I'm asking the question, how do they relate to each other? Like one of the questions that comes up again and again is, when you have an object of knowledge, say my hand is an object, or the colour of my hand is an object, did that experience, did the object of knowledge arise and then my knowing it, or did, I mean, it couldn't have been the other way around. I couldn't have known it and then it arose, so it must have arisen and then I knew it. But then how could I know it if it wasn't already there? So it couldn't have been there before. So all the time you're asking these questions, you need to be looking at the thinking process. There's something wrong with the thinking process. But however much you see it's wrong, you still do it again. I say you do. Yeah. Normally, we still find we're doing it again. So then we try to get philosophical and we sort of think, oh, well, they sort of arise together. But if they arise together, how are they different? Why are we calling them two different things? And if they didn't exist separately, then how could you say they're now together? But again, it's the way we're thinking that's got to be one of those, either or else it doesn't do any of that. Which might be right, in a sense, but the way we're thinking it doesn't do any of that. It's just a thought, really. It's just my idea. It doesn't arise together, it doesn't arise separately. And it doesn't, whatever you say, it isn't that. But that's, again, hasn't got me anywhere because I've just thought, oh, it isn't any of those things. But I still don't know how it happens. So the only way I know it happens, how it is because before I started thinking about it, that was all I had. So the only way to get at what that knowledge is to become more and more simple about it, which is very, very difficult, actually, because we go so quickly into a theory or an idea. And one of the most fundamental ideas, and we talked about this last time, but I could talk about it endlessly, because it's that we think it exists in time. I think the process of knowing happens in time. So, like, there's a moment of this thing that I think is outside, and then there's a moment of this thing that I think is inside. I mean, thing in the loosest possible sense. And that somehow one of them came first, and then came the other one. Or they came together, but again as a moment in time. And that as soon as they'd come together in that moment of time, they actually went because they were now past. Does that make sense? So if they're going to be together, then they've got to pass from the past moment of being together into the present moment of being together. And again, keep looking at the way you're trying to think about it. It's sort of like your mind is working really hard to kind of, how could that how could it have passed? How could it still be there if it's passed away? So your mind's really trying to, it's gone, but it's still there. And you're trying to, and that's really the mind, that mind that's trying to do that is the mind that we're trying to wear out and give way to some other way of seeing, if you like. And although it doesn't say that in all these progressive stages of meditation, if you go and speak to a teacher about it, this is what, met somebody who's really trying to get you to understand, this is always what you'll come back to. This mind that there's a word for it in Sanskrit which is prapancha. Tibetan it's trapa. Our mind is trying all the time to complicate it or elaborate it or make something out of it. And because of that, we're confusing ourselves. And because we don't notice we're doing that, we succeed. And we have this very clear sense that there is inside and outside. That's one of the most fundamental ways that we make sense of our world. So unless you can really go plumb the depths of this, it's better to think there's an inside and an outside than to think that there isn't. But it could be more subtle than that. What's really going on could be understood in a much more subtle and simple and powerful way. So that's why it's worth meditating in the way that the Citta Matrins were doing, by looking at the experience of the senses and the sense objects, including thoughts and feelings, and the mind that knows the thought or feeling, and trying to really not complicate it by dividing, like the Abhidharmists had done. There are these definite things, and there's definite states of mind, and somehow they have to kind of meet together in time and space. They thought, what would happen if you don't try to do any of that? You just stay very, very simple. So when something, you arise, something is an object of knowing, is known by the senses, you remain very simple and you don't try to grasp that there's an object that's outside or can be grasped by this grasping mind. That I just meditate without, to the best I can, to not let that happen. And what they found when they tried to meditate like that, I'm saying they as if I know what they were doing, I don't know what they're doing, but if you do it, this is what you find. You find that if you try to do what they're talking about there, you find that actually, for want of a better word, you'd call it mind, is actually free of that distinction. And that mind that's free from that distinction is luminous. It's knowing. It's, if you like, it's the essence of all our experience. It's all there. And then from that, we then create this more complicated view of an inside and an outside, or seer and seen, subject and object. That we do that as it's an add-on to what we're really experiencing. So really aiming to be very simple, you actually realise that complication, before the complication there is what they call this pure mind. Just pure mind. So then they tried to think, and they experienced that. They experienced this pure mind, and they realised that if they were to keep practising letting go of that complicating process of dividing inside and outside, self, other, or object, subject, object. If they didn't conceptually divide it, they just let it be as simple as they could. They were experiencing this clarity, and they called this a self-illuminating, self-knowing, self-illuminating mind. But they hadn't gone as far as the next step in the process of meditation. So when they thought about it, they still thought it must be going on moment by moment. So this must be momentary, moments of clarity. That was like a stream of clarity that was going on. And I think last time I was talking to you about the Arya Vijnana, wasn't I? That somehow there's this, because you've got a problem. Once you start saying everything's momentary, you think there's time, and time is moments. You can divide time into moments, can't you? Like there's now, there's past, there's future. So then there has to be another now, and this now is now past, and the future one is now. And I mean, that's how we all think. I mean, children think that way. We all think that way. I forgot what I was going to say. Where was it going? Oh yeah, that's right. So you've got this problem of continuity. If it's really like that, if the past is really gone, future hasn't come, and this moment is very short, but then how does it join to the next one? To make a continuity. So they thought about it, and they thought a lot about all of this, and they came up with this term, the Arya Vijnana, the ground consciousness that somehow goes on, just keeps going. So that's always there, keeping it all together over time, and that somehow or other things are registered. So when something happens, when we do something, it gets registered in the Arya Vijnana, and then later on, it's like a seed. When the result comes, it's like that ripens and something happens. So if you plant a seed, just physically, if you plant a seed, if the past was gone and the future not come, then the seed wouldn't go anywhere, would it? So somehow the seed has to pass from the moment you planted it to the time when it's growing and it's become a fruit. So, and same with karmic actions and results, or following the path to awakening. There has to be some medium by means of which you can have a continuity. So they called that the Arya Vijnana. And they had lots of discussions about that, apparently, and from what you can tell, that what was its nature, really. But one of the things it had to have in it, it had to have this clear, self-illuminating, self-knowing mind that could be purified by not attaching to subject and object in such a strong way. So then they called the things you attached to that weren't ever there really were called do you remember, imaginary nature, Parakalpita. But the mind itself, the Arya Vijnana, and all the different sense consciousnesses and this clear light mind that would eventually become purified, that wasn't illusion really. That was kind of real, but still momentary. They didn't get beyond that. So then how do you get enlightened? How do you free this mind from this overlay of complication? Is you meditate on the emptiness of the mind, including all those things, the Arya Vijnana and the sense consciousnesses and the clear light, and you specially meditate on how it is empty of the Parakalpita, that within that mind there is no imagined things of subject and object that you've noticed what cause all the complication. And by doing that, the clear light mind becomes more and more free and clear, and even more importantly, there's no attachment anymore, because you're not seeing things as separate that you're attached to. So, because you're not so attached, you don't suffer. And of course, any kind of fear or hatred or hostility, it all comes from attachment, doesn't it? Because if you weren't attached to yourself and attached to something that was threatening, you wouldn't be afraid of it. You wouldn't be opposed to it, because there wouldn't be any separation anyway. So all that complication then leads to the other kleshas, which then leads to suffering. So this is really the path to liberation, so that by meditating on the emptiness of the Paratantra, that's the Arya Vijnana and all the mind parts of the mind, of this dichotomy, this separation of my subject and object, you actually purify the mind and arrive at liberation. So that's introduces a few technical words, but it's basically pretty straightforward, I think, as a way of practicing. So you should try it, so to see what happens. Especially this kind of mysteriousness of what kind of universe is it is. If you could say, if you've already done the Shravaka view, your sense of what you are is now much more subtle, because you're not confusing yourself with the skandhas. But at the same time, you and the universe are not separate and different entities. So both become quite different, don't they? The universe becomes quite different, and you become quite different. But what do you think you are? And I was looking at some notes by Khenpo Rinpoche, and was interested that he made a point that was coming up for me very strongly as I tried to again meditate like this very deliberately, which was when we pray to the Buddha, we pray to the lineage, we open our hearts and think of the Buddha. Oh, in a universe where we're not all separate, when you think of them, when they think of me, they wouldn't see me as separate. And when I think of them and don't think of them as separate, then we're not separate. That makes a huge difference, doesn't it? Kind of sheds light on the reason why we feel people in our heart. We feel people are not separate in our heart, don't we? Especially, difficult times, or when they die, you sort of say, oh, you're in my heart. And then we kind of think, oh, yes, that's really good, really nice. We recognise something in that that's important. I think, well, that's a very Citta Matra view, isn't it? Not separate. But you don't mean we've all become objectified. It's almost the opposite, isn't it? We've all become very real. But we can't, when you're talking about somebody in your heart, you don't sort of literally think in this kind of heavy, clumsy way, or they out there have sort of come in here. We're not thinking like that, so we're perfectly capable of not doing that, which is interesting, isn't it? We're perfectly capable of it. There's the proof. But it goes much further. That way of knowing could be extended, and so it's very closely related to compassion and the compassion of the whole Mahayana enterprise. Well, there's a whole lot more I could say about that. I could run a whole series of talks on the Citta Matra, but I think it's would be good to move on to the next view, which is the Madhyamaka view. And so that's page 65. And I don't know, maybe I didn't mention to you that in the Madhyamaka, Madhya means middle, Madhyamaka is the middle way. And, well, we all know that the Buddha always called his teaching the middle way, didn't he? And he always called it the teaching, the middle way between all views. He said, I don't, in a sense, what I'm talking about is the truth, not just a view. You have to go beyond views and open out to the truth. And this is very much what the Madhyamaka is stressing. So I would say it's very much going back to what the Buddha first said in the first place. Yes, it's the dropping of views. So they found fault with the Citta Matra view in the sense that they were saying, well, everything's mind, and that there is this mind, this self-illuminating, self-aware mind. And just as the Abhidharmists before had kind of been putting forward all these dharmas that truly existed and that could be become kind of a block. And the same with the Citta Matra view, having this idea that there is this Alaya Vijnana and these different Vijnanas and these different minds and these different ways of being and this mind that is going from moment to moment, this clear light mind that knows itself. These are all things that can be pinned down and described and understood. A kind of a system of some kind. They thought, well, actually, it can't be understood like that, because you take this clear light mind that's supposed to know itself. How can a mind know itself? A mind takes as knowledge an object of mind. How can it take its own self as its own object? That isn't possible. It doesn't make sense. So you can say, well, then what does make sense then? And actually, as long as you're trying to make sense of it with this other kind of mind, this mind that's trying to pin it down as something, as long as you're trying to do that, you are not going to get at how you know anything, for that matter. So this self-illuminating, self-knowingness, if you try to analyse it with your ordinary mind that's thinking in terms of time and space and, things are separate or whatever, or logically even, logically you try to find a definition, take that as given, and then sort of on the basis of that definition you can say, that this is this and this is that. But even if you any way you try to do that, you end up with contradictions. And it's a worthwhile discipline to go through that and see for yourself that you in your ordinary thinking mind can see for yourself that actually it leads to contradictions. And I think that's a very helpful exercise to do. And it is spiral learning as well, because you do it once, maybe in one session, and you think, oh yeah, that's good, I've got that, I understand that now. And then you sit down for your next session and you realise you've forgotten how it was that you got to that point, and you've gone back to your old way of thinking. So you can do it, you can treat these as koans, these little puzzles. You can treat them as I imagine Japanese treat koans. You keep coming back to it again and again, because every time you come back to it, you're coming back to that kind of mind that is convinced by that. So every time you come back to that conviction, there must be things outside. Okay, there must be things outside. So how do I know them? And then again ending up saying, so my mind that thinks it can know how I know things, that isn't working. It isn't how I know things. Can I meditate like that? Can I rest the mind like that? As Rinpoche says, can I rest my mind in that emptiness of it not being like I thought it was? Can I? And sometimes you can a little bit, and that's very powerful. I've forgotten where I was going again. This is testing you all. I can't remember, but can you? I can't remember where I was going. In the Madhyamaka, wasn't I?
How can the mind take itself as permanent?
That's right. That's how they were criticising the Citta Matrins. They would make fun of them. I mean, I say they made fun of them. I don't know who I'm talking about. But actually the texts get quite rude about, you people who think blah, blah, and then they'd be extremely rude about each other. But, probably the other side don't take it seriously because they think, well, I don't think that. That's not what I think. But it's quite a good Aunt Sally, you set up this wrong view that corresponds very much to how you are already thinking yourself. And then you kind of see what's wrong with it. So you don't need to treat it as polemics against another school. You can just use it against your own way of thinking, because these are all ways that we think. So what's wrong with thinking that you have this mind that knows itself is that as soon as you think you know this mind that knows itself, you've got a problem. Because how does this mind know itself? How does this mind make itself into its object to know itself? It's, we have the problem ourselves, don't we? So we don't need to talk about them out there who have this view. We've got it ourselves. So then, if you're trying to be a good Madhyamaka person, you think, oh yeah, that's wrong, so I'm not doing that. But of course, just thinking that you're not doing it doesn't mean you're not. And also doesn't mean you found the point of it all. It doesn't mean that you found what it is that this is all pointing at. So there's, if you read around in this Tibetan Buddhist stuff, you get, you can read endlessly about all the different schools and different commentators sort of saying what's wrong with what everybody else thinks. And as Khenpo Rinpoche always says, that's only helpful if you use it for helping your meditation. Otherwise it's just give you a headache. But it can be very helpful, as he said. It can really help to sharpen up your awareness. So that was the main criticism against the Citta Matrins, that you couldn't have, if you like, a theory about everything's mind, because any view that you hold is a view, and is the conceptual mind still overworking, if you like, and you have to go towards that simplicity. And they all base themselves on a teacher called Nagarjuna. Have you all heard of Nagarjuna? Who's heard of Nagarjuna? So not everybody. So Nagarjuna, I've forgotten his date. What date was he? Oh, you can look it up. What?
500 years after the Buddha.
Something like that, yeah. I'm very bad on dates. But a long time ago. just when the Mahayana was starting to develop. And he wrote something called the Root Verses, Mula Madhyamaka Karikas, the root verses of the Madhyamaka. And in those verses, he's basically attacking Abhidharma, showing that actually all these different things that we think we know, like cause and effect and self and other, and I can't think of any examples now. Well, we'll be coming to them anyway. He goes through all these, and in each verse he shows that one concept depends on another concept, and since these two concepts depend on each other, then whatever it is that you're talking about actually, in a sense, doesn't exist. Which, as I said to Tara this morning, sometimes I sort of get a bit fed up with these arguments, because you feel, well, yeah, one concept depends on, you can't have dark without light. So dark doesn't exist without light. And light doesn't make any sense if there isn't dark. So, you sort of think, well, yeah, the two concepts depend on each other. But, yeah. It's quite interesting to take it then into meditation and realise I get attached to things. I get attached to, I want it to be like this, I don't want it to be like that. And actually, when you look at what it is that you've turned into what you like or you don't like, actually they're concepts. So you could relax your mind. The interesting thing then is, if you meditate like that, what happens? Philosophically, it's of no interest at all. Because, yeah, everybody knows concepts depend on each other, so what? But if you actually use it as a way of cutting through your own assumptions about your experience, something else can start to emerge. But there was a lot of argument about among the Madhyamikas about exactly what was the point that Nagarjuna was making. I think it's very clear. Which, of course, they all thought theirs idea was clear too. You've got different kinds of Madhyamaka. Madhyamikas, people who say they were following Nagarjuna. So there was one lot called the Svatantrikas, and there was one lot called the Prasangikas. Has any of you ever heard of either of those terms? Not many, okay. I mean, it sounds awfully it sounds frightful having all these technical terms, doesn't it? But it's all relevant to our experience, and you don't really need to learn the names. But what was happening with the Svatantrikas were they were very rigorous in following Nagarjuna and showing how, all the, like you couldn't have, say you had a sense and a sense object, but the sense, like I've been just saying, the sense object depends on the sense. The moment of a sense depends on there being a sense object present. But if you've got the two moments arising separately in succession, there's no connection between them. If they arise together, then you wouldn't get any sense impression. So whichever way you looked at it, however perception was happening, it wasn't like that. So I've been struggling with how to translate this word for not truly existing. That's a translation of an expression in Tibetan, which is Demba Madrub. And it's Demba Madrub in Tibetan is as a verb. Drub is a verb. So it's not, and sometimes translators say it's not established. It's not truly established. Or I suppose you could say it's not truly proved. So you can't really prove or establish that things, that the object appears before or after the consciousness of it, or together or separately. And, it's quite argued quite strongly in some of the commentaries. You can't, and therefore they're not Demba Madrub. They're not established, which is not a natural use of English, is it? So I was trying to think of a more natural use of English. Most translators go for, and I think I do most of the time, say, well, they don't exist. But that doesn't make any sense, does it, to say nothing exists at all? I mean, even if something's an illusion, something exists, isn't it? There's something there that's knowing the illusion. There's something there that's causing the illusion. There's something there that's making the illusion. So to say it doesn't exist is not very satisfactory, is it? So I think, well, just to say it doesn't exist. So I was struggling this morning, thinking, how could we translate it better? For that, what could that verb be? Because it's not the same verb as to grasp. It's not like, when I read the arguments, I think, well, it would work if we said it's not graspable. So you can't grasp it as being coming before, you can't grasp it as coming after, you can't grasp it as coming both the same, and you can't grasp it as not either. So you can't grasp what, the cause and the effect. Like if a cause has to precede an effect, then while the effect hasn't arisen, it's not really a cause. You can't grasp it as a cause because it's just what it is. It isn't. But then by the time the cause has arrived, the effect has arisen, the cause has disappeared. So you can't really say what's disappeared is actually just produced something separate. So these arguments go on endlessly, and as I said, philosophically they're not very interesting, but from the point of view of meditation, they are very interesting because they bring you nearer and nearer to that mind that's trying to make it, and then think, so what else? What else is there in my experience? What other way of knowing? How am I actually living? Because if I think I'm doing one thing which I'm not doing, but I'm still operational, so I must be doing it in a way I don't realise I'm doing it. I must be knowing in a way I don't realise I'm knowing. And so it actually opens something up. But when you read the arguments just as they are, I don't know why people can study it for years and think it's philosophy. So anyone who can do that can maybe try and convince me. But it is, you can take a verse a day and use it as a meditation, and just with another, it's always, I think it always helps our attention if we're trying something new, aren't we? Even though actually they're all the same. The argument actually is always the same argument, but just applying it to different things, in experience, it's a very good discipline. So Madhyamaka is very important to all the Tibetan Buddhist schools, and I would say it's actually no different from what the Buddha said in the first place. I think this is the Buddhist middle way, kind of going beyond all views. When you see that whatever view it is you adopt, it's not working, and yet you've not become dysfunctional. So you can't say, and I notice Rinpoche tends to say in the Madhyamaka Svatantrika, you just think, so none of these things exist, so you just rest in the emptiness. It sounds very nihilistic, doesn't it? And actually I've never been able to do that. I've always had that niggle going on. But that's just an idea. Which, actually that's covered by moving on to the next stage. But, I think probably it would be, you could stay there for a while, just looking at that actually it does all disappear. Nothing that I thought was as it is, and as how I thought it was, it's all disappeared. And that can become a very, very strong experience. Very strong experience. Sometimes it just happens suddenly to people without them, sometimes when, I don't know, maybe it's some past, they've been practicing in the past and it comes up, or I think sometimes even when, people very stressed, or you're in balance. Sometimes you can have very strong experiences of suddenly everything disappearing. It can be very scary. Very interesting. So that's the Madhyamaka. Now, why do we have a separate Svatantrika and Prasangika Madhyamaka? Oh, I've just noticed. Is that an hour?
It is. I mean, you can. As long as you feel like
Oh, I'll just answer this one question and then see if you've got questions. That I just asked the question to myself. So, why do you have the Svatantrika and the Prasangika? So the Svatantrikas really stress that if you argue well, you can show that in the ultimate analysis nothing exists, and then if nothing exists, then there's a danger that we will think it doesn't matter what I do because nothing exists anyway. So that's quite a dangerous place to be. What they mean is it's nothing exists and is beyond all concepts. So you can rest in that emptiness of concepts, but people might well understand it to mean, everything's empty, nothing exists, so it doesn't matter what I do. Yes, it does matter what you do. So there's this relative truth, or this seeming truth, or however you want to put it, which is the cause and effect that happens. If you plant seeds, you do get results. If you do a bad action, you will get a bad result. If you practice Dharma, you will get to enlightenment. Yes, there is cause and effect. Even though ultimately it's all empty. So they put a lot of emphasis on these two truths, that you had to respect both truths. The truth that happens, works in your everyday life, and then this other truth, which is the ultimate reality. But they didn't really, there was a lot of discussion in the Madhyamaka schools about how these two truths related together, because it's obviously something a bit fishy, isn't there? Kind of. Whoops, got to save myself, I've got to somehow explain how the world is, how it is. So the Svatantrikas tried to argue these two truths and how they related together, and that were they separate or were they the same, and a lot of discussion about that. Whereas the Prasangikas were much more rigorously non-philosophical. They much more rigorously said, no, if you start coming up with these kind of ideas of there's relative truth that's relatively existent and absolute truth, absolute existence, you're just playing the same game again. You're still getting caught up in holding views. You've got two views now. You're holding one view, which is there's the absolute, and another view that there is the relative, and those are just views again. So it's not. You've got to be much more rigorous and not have a view about the absolute and not have a view about the relative either. Doesn't mean you reject the relative. If you sort of say, cause and effects don't work, well, that's another view. So, cause and effects in terms of the world, they work in terms of the world. But I'm not saying that because they exist or they not exist or I hold any view about it. So, that's a lot of discussion about that. And I think we can see that in ourselves as well, can't we? That when we're trying to think, well, the relative is just a view. So, so then does that mean I can do whatever I like? Well, that would also be a view, wouldn't it? So, it's quite interesting. So if I think the relative... And I do notice some Buddhists do that. They sort of say, let's forget about this absolute truth thing. Let's just get on with the relative truth. We practical people, we're just interested in the relative truth. We're not interested in that airy-fairy absolute truth. Well, then there's no path to liberation, is there? That's kind of just like adopting a view of, I like this, I like thinking about practical things in the world, and I don't like all this philosophical stuff. It's just views again. It's not... There's nothing. There's no reason why. if you're really seeing the true nature of reality, that you would lose interest in the practical world. Because that's inherently the nature of reality, so there wouldn't be any sense of losing interest in the practicalities of life. Even though sometimes it's practical to not get too involved in the practicalities of life. But so there was a lot of argument about that. And that goes on to this day about what is a true Prasangika view. Any of you who've read my thesis will know that I was arguing against a supervisor and an examiner who were, really top of their game, scholars in the Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism, and all their texts and sources which they'd all studied and for decades and knew them inside out, and I was trying to argue another view of what the Prasangika was. With my little minuscule amount of knowledge and experience and study, and relying on Rinpoche's knowledge really. But the Gelugpa school, from the point of view of the mainstream Madhyamaka Prasangikas, the Gelugpa Madhyamaka Prasangika isn't really Prasangika. It's more like, whatever it is. So when you're reading books that call themselves Prasangika, you might hear something different than what you've got in here, because they call their thing Prasangika. But in general, in Tibetan Buddhism, it's considered to be kind of like the thing to be Prasangika. And although there is a strong body of Nyingmas who would probably call themselves Svatantrika more, but then they wouldn't accept this. I mean, I mentioned, I think, in one sentence that there are Svatantrikas who are slightly different. It would be like the Nyingma Svatantrikas, but I don't know how much you want to get into all of that. I think it becomes relevant if you're being taught in a particular way, and it's quite nice to know how that fits into the whole scheme of things. So from your point of view, you're being taught by me, yes, Prasangika, but also Madhyamaka, and this is the third kind of Madhyamaka. So we've got the Svatantrika Madhyamaka, Prasangika Madhyamaka, and then sometimes called Yogacara Madhyamaka, or using a Tibetan term, Shentong Madhyamaka. So you all know in that verse that Rigzin Shikpo wrote for My Long Life, that issuing from the groundless space of light, how does it go? To spread the magnificent doctrine, Dharma of Shentong. So now we've arrived at Shentong. And we'll do that next time. So we can refer back a bit to the other Madhyamakas, because we can then see them in contrast to the Shentong Madhyamaka. So I'll make that my next talk. So that was very brief and rather dismissive description of Svatantrika and Madhyamaka. So excuse that, but yeah, I mean, as I said, with all of this, people spend 12 years of their life studying all these different texts. I mean, there's lots to be said. So I had a couple of questions. I'm being surprised. I was saying to Tara, I'm surprised I'm not getting more questions, because this is all quite difficult stuff. If you're reading the book, every time I read it, I come up with more questions. So I'm surprised I haven't been plied with many questions. So there's some comments really by Dedan. So saying she found the paper on reflection and meditation on the view, Citta Matra view, helpful for focusing on the essential points. So that's nice, like an anchor to bring the mind home from the explanations in all the various materials. So that's good. That works for her. And then the paper that starts when you talk about mind. I wrote something on mind which I had hoped would be clearer than it was. And I think I mentioned to everyone that actually I need to rewrite that. Because we talk about mind, there's so many words that get translated as mind, and I did try to sort it out a bit, but I didn't do it thoroughly enough. So I need to do that again when I've got time to think it all through carefully. But anyway, what she noticed was I didn't quite get those explanations, and I've only just worked out why not. At least I think so. I think it was because I'm still trying to understand what the Citta Matrins are saying, while you seem to be taking the discourse into a different level. Yes, I was... Apparently I'd called the thing the three natures. The fact in your first sentence refers to different levels of talking about mind, but the paper title is the three natures, so I guess I was expecting to read about the three natures as explained in the Citta Matra school. So when you talk about the power tantra as the mind with a power of its own, perhaps we could call it the power of the Buddha nature. I was left confused and not surprised, because you wouldn't... Yeah. I mean, Buddha nature itself is explained differently according to these different views. That's something else you also need to be aware of. The way I talk about Buddha nature is always from a Shentong point of view. But if someone was talking about Buddha nature from a Citta Matra point of view, they would talk about it differently. All the other views would talk about it differently. I was left confused. I had understood the power tantra to be the dependent nature, right. So called because it is dependently arising phenomenon, right, like a dream, right, like the mind of a dream, yes. Then when I read on, it is only really the Buddha nature, when the power tantra is free of confusion, etc. I began to see where you are going with it, but I didn't feel it was helping me to understand the Citta Matra view particularly. Yes, I, as I said, I need to go through that whole thing again. Having said that, under two, this last point, I've come to see your earlier point about how the views illuminate each other, both forwards and backwards, as it were. And I think that's a really important point, isn't it? That, the first view of not self helps you to understand the next view of it's all mind, and the next view is beyond. And each view becomes clearer when you understood the next one. And the last one is clearer when you've understood the first one, so that, But then when you've understood the last one, then you realise, a lot of my questions about the first one are answered in the last one, so I can, don't need to be held up by that. So that happens through reflection and meditation rather than study. Yes, I would think so. As you know, I've been working with progressive stages for years, but decided to focus more intensively on Shravaka view for the time being. And now I'm giving more time to Citta Matra view. That's good. I've had moments of really seeing how you mean that, I think. Yes. So this question from Tara. My question is about the definition of the Power Tantra and Paranishpana. So that's the dependent nature and the ultimate nature, let's say. I get that the parakalpita is the distorted way things appear when we are grasping at perceiver and perceived. Right. And the paratantra is what is there in our experience without that grasping. So that's the mind. When there's... Well, yes, paratantra... I was wondering whether the klesha mind itself was in the paratantra. I guess it would be. The klesha mind is there, but not what it imagines is there, which isn't anything. But that distortion is happening within the mind, isn't it? So it's sort of somehow a certain reality. It's probably a moot point. The Paranishpana is the truth of the emptiness of the Paratantra, right? So it's really interesting. The Paranishpana, the ultimate nature, this is quite interesting. Because if everything has these three natures, so its nature as being separate is not true, just imagined. Its nature as appearing as a manifestation within the mind, distorted or not, is the Paratantra. Then the nature that if I look at the Paratantra without imposing the Parakalpita, without imposing the imaginary nature on it, if I don't distort it, then that's the way to look. That's the ultimate nature. That's the way to look, isn't it? Is the ultimate nature. So I've struggled with this a lot when I was writing the thesis as well. Are these people saying, or am I saying, is it a fact about the mind, about the Paratantra, that it is empty of what I imagine is there? Is it that fact? And you think, well, a fact is almost like a conceptually created statement, isn't it? So you can't really be meditating on a statement that this is empty of that. You know, like it's empty of perceive and perceived. I mean, I'm not meditating on that sentence, am I? It's a bit puzzling. So, but if the ultimate nature is the emptiness of the perceiver and perceived, you know, the Paratantra is empty of the Parakalpita, how am I going to meditate on a sentence like that? So what is the actual ultimate nature, ultimate truth? Because one truth is that there is this pure mind. This is what, from the Citta Matra point of view, they say there is this pure stream of moments of mind that's purified of this mistake. And the ultimate nature is to meditate on that mind. You don't meditate on the mind, you meditate on the emptiness of that mind. So I guess you'd have to experiment with it, wouldn't you? And they clearly were experimenting with it, like becoming really aware as their mind became very simple, didn't grasp that those are separate. Some other experience arose. But then when they formulated it, they kind of described the experience as dependently arising because they thought it was momentary, which when we first experience it, does seem momentary. So they called the unchanging, because all Buddhists have to accept that the ultimate nature is unchanging. Otherwise it would be dependently arising and would not be ultimate. So the only thing that's unchanging is that the mind is empty of this distinction. But it does seem a little bit philosophical, doesn't it? This is why they got so criticised, I think. But when we come to the Shentong view, we will realise it doesn't have any of those faults, but it's criticised by everybody by having all the faults. So it's up to us really to see whether we're falling into those faults or not. It's what Khenpo Rinpoche always says. You know, like when you get to the Shentong view and you think, yeah, that's it, that's my view, and then you look at the criticisms of it, you have to make sure you've not fallen into any of those, you know, into those faults that people would say it has, you know, because they say, well, it's another view, isn't it? So you've got to look to see, well, is my view of Shentong actually just another view? I like this view, I believe in it, so that's my view. Or is it really my view beyond all views? So it's all good fun, isn't it? So have I finished that? How are the three natures similar or different to a Shentong view? Oh, well, that's next time. And do the Paratantra and Paranishpana have some truly existent nature? The Citta Matras would say they did, but we would question that. I say we because, we all agree with me, don't we? Is the Paranishpana simply the fact of knowing the Paratantra is empty? Yes. If so, why would that have its own nature? Why would that be a nature? Well, I don't know. They say three kinds of self-nature. Is it Svabhava? I think it's three Svabhavas, yes. But it is worth distinguishing them, especially when you get to the Shentong view. It becomes makes much more sense when you come to the Shentong view. In other words, what is the key point about having three natures rather than simply two, the distorted way things appear and the way things truly are? I think it's because, by all Buddhist standards, the ultimate has to be non-conditioned. So you've got to find, even though you haven't actually seen anything unconditioned, you're thinking that the clear light mind is conditioned because it's dependently arising. Just by all Buddhist doctrine standards, ultimate reality has to be unconditioned. So they have to somehow find something unconditioned. So the truth that it's always empty is sort of like not conditioned. It's a bit Weasley, but... I think it's important to realise that all these systems are quite Weasley if you treat them as philosophy, and that helps you to realise when people might say, "Oh, the Shentong view is, like it's the worst of all possible views because it's blah blah blah." You think, yes, well, any of these views, if they're not understood, they fall into some fault or other. So Shentong I think is the most elegant view and fits best with what the Buddha originally said. But if you misunderstand it, it can turn into the worst of all worlds, because you just think, it's what Sangha Akshita worries about and has always been worried about throughout the Buddhist history, is that if you have this idea that, I have this Buddha nature, or like, theistic religion, we're all God, we're all children of God, and that's it. There's really no room for manoeuvre, is there? Like, you're just grasping onto this idea and you're just the same as you were before. So it's very difficult to shift and go deeper into it. I mean, I'm not saying that, any theistic religion doesn't take things into a more deep and subtle way, but almost always they end up having to go through the same process that we have to go through about looking at, this grasping at views and realising that we're not, although we think, oh yes, I really believe in God, God's wonderful, and I feel very happy when I think of God, and I'm a good Christian, I believe in God, and and then you start grasping it, you think you've understood God, and of course then you become a pain, because you kind of fundamentalist Christian type who's sort of trying to impose your view on everyone because you think God's told you, but that's all because of grasping at views, isn't it? Whereas somebody who's on a spiritual path, who's learning not to grasp at views, would probably be much more, be in the same sort of ballpark of discussing the same sort of things that we are. So, any questions? You can always write them to me. I really like to receive questions. Is that because you're all too bombarded with too much information? Yes, somebody's nodding. Yes, a bit overwhelmed. Yeah.
This might be really quick. It's just when you were saying about senses and sense objects, and they can't arise before. They can't arise separately, and they can't arise together.
Mm.
Can they not arise together? Like the object and when you're seeing of it, would that not be?
So they're arising, and how long are they staying? Like they rise together? Because normally if you're knowing something, you know it because you're seeing something, aren't you?
Mm.
So if they rose together, how would you see it? I'm not too sure. I think I'd have to come back at this fresh because it's a whole elaborate way of arguing. Maybe write it for next time. Because I didn't look very carefully at these arguments because sometimes they're quite tiresome. But I know they do work when I focus on them properly. Yeah. Yeah. I'd have to look at it again. I knew I was cheating. She picked me up. Yeah, I just read that just now, but I didn't really think about it carefully. Trying to remember some of these Madhyamaka arguments, different arguments. Yeah?
Presumably this is just something to look at in experience, but why would Citta Matra say that everything is mind only rather than saying that it's space only? Because if space is a continuous kind of thing, then time wouldn't be necessarily such a problem if whatever is the sense object transfers itself to, say, light, because that's how we understand now how we see. And then light takes up some of the moments through space, between the sense object and the sense impression. I don't know if that works.
I can see several lines of thought going on at once there. Because light would also have the same problem of momentariness, wouldn't it? And space would have the same problem of momentariness. If it was taken as an object.
Maybe I don't understand the problem of momentariness.
Yeah, it takes some thinking about. You really need to check to yourself whether it's true that I think the past is gone. But do I really think the past is gone? I mean, part of me thinks, yes, of course, that's what defines it as past. But if it really had gone, how's there any continuity? It's a major problem, isn't it? Now, I don't think the Citta Matras really saved themselves from that problem. I mean, they invented this idea of the Arya Vijnana, at least acknowledging there was a problem. But I don't think they, certainly from what's come down to us, as the kind of, this is what the Citta Matras thought. I don't know if it is what they really thought. But it's come down to us as something that wasn't really resolved, what this Arya Vijnana was. Exactly. Because until you do move into the Shentong view, you keep coming up with the same problems. But when you've actually gone through the Prasangika and you've really let go of all views, then it becomes possible to look at your experience again, but only experientially. And you can still talk about it, but you're talking about it like all the Dzogchen stuff. You talk about it experientially. You don't talk about it in terms of something that you can analyse. You can only helps you to see something that you could experience. So basically, as long as you are analysing it in this with this kind of mind, that's why I was emphasising it's that kind of mind. So that even, the question that Tara raised, like where I hurried over what their arguments were, but I knew in myself it was right, because I knew that as soon as you tried to understand how perception worked, and you've got this idea of an object known by a subject, and if there's any way of thinking about it that is actually conceptual, you can't make it work. I mean, there's probably different ways you could argue it. But if you can actually know it without any of that sort of mind that's trying to make something out of it, you do know it. Mm. And in a way you could say it is simultaneous, but it's not really simultaneous in that it's the same moment. It's just that there isn't any time, really. The time is something that's secondary to what the knowing. So the timing is a way of ordering what's been already known, but then that implies a whole different worldview. So the Shentong view does imply a whole different worldview. When I say worldview, I mean, it's kind of, you're now talking post-Madhyamaka, and you're using language post-Madhyamaka, if you see what I mean. Like, until you've gone through the Madhyamaka, anything you're saying could be just another view. If you accept, okay, as long as it's not a view, we can talk about it. We can find our way around, but actually we know that actually that's just fingers pointing at the moon. It isn't actually anything real. It's something, what's real can't be grasped like that. Yeah, so sometimes when you're looking at these early ones and you're trying to work out what's their logic, why are they making that their logic? Yeah, I think you could spend a lot of time on that. Maybe profitably, maybe not. Yeah, but it is worth looking at it, because we do, as you say, we are thinking in that way, and we're thinking, well, couldn't it work like this? Couldn't it work like that? And keep thinking about it, and if you're still convinced that it could be like that, come and tell me. Because, I'd be pleased, because I'd know that you'd actually been working on it yourself. And you were trying to come up with something that sounded different from what I was saying, which would show me this was really you that thinking like this. So it gives me a lot to work with. Whereas if you're just trying to conform to the book, it's not so much to work with, because, you're not really thinking yourself. It's quite interesting. You use the book to find out what you think yourself. Oh, look, you're looking a bit dazed. I hope it was all right. Takes me back to my thesis days. Struggling with all this stuff in foreign languages. Not just French, and not only Sanskrit and Tibetan, but the main work on Buddha nature was written in French. So it used to be quite hard work.
Have they got more words for it all than English, have they?
No, French is more difficult than English because the words are less flexible. So this is, I'm not that good at French, but French people tell me that English is better because our words are naturally, you can use them in more wider range. So you can use a word like mind and it can be used in different ways, whereas their words are more clearly defined. So if you want to find a word that's for a new concept, using a French word, it's very difficult to stretch it. Apparently, that's what French people tell me. That's why they like studying. They like studying Dharma in English. It's just quite interesting. Partly because, well, Patricia will know. Partly because there's more books in English, and you've started learning Dharma in English. It's part of it, I think. I don't know. You're going to have to forge ahead teaching Dharma in Polish, aren't you? You're going to have to go through what I went through.
People are doing that.
Huh?
People are already doing that.
You're already doing that.
When people in Poland are already.
Oh yeah,
teaching
and you
Dharma
were
in
presumably
Polish.
when you were translating.
Yeah.
It's a nightmare, isn't it?
Well, I would argue that other languages that are more closer to Latin, like French and Polish, they're much more precise. So, in a sense, yes, you are missing out on the flexibility, but then you gain the precision.
Interesting.
You don't have to explain around that much.
Right.
So yes, you're kind of, but you really need to know your subject then, because once you said it, it's said and it's quite precise.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
All right. We dedicate this punya to the enlightenment of all sentient beings. May all sentient beings realize complete and perfect awakening. May the heart's awareness awaken in the unawakened. Where it has begun to stir, may it never fade, and may it awaken fully. Chantu Samni Rinpoche Maje Banam Jejuji Shebanyamba Mepadam Kane Gondu Belwashu Chantu Samni Rinpoche Maje Banam Jejuji Shebanyamba Mepadam Kane Gondu Belwashu Chanchu Samni Rinpoche Maje Banam Jejuji Jebanyamba Mepadam Kane Kondu Pelwa